If you're watching this from anywhere around the world, drop your country in the comments. And if you enjoy these wild HOA stories, make sure you like the video and subscribe because this one starts small and explodes fast. The afternoon began quietly, the kind of slow, warm day when the neighborhood felt half asleep. I had invited a few friends over for a small weekend gathering. Nothing loud, nothing wild, just a simple get-together with food and a bit of music inside the house. My driveway could fit 4 cars, so when I sent out the invitation, I didn't anticipate any problems. But problems in an HOA neighborhood never wait to be invited. The first sign of trouble came before the first guest even stepped inside. A silver SUV rolled past my home twice, moving slow enough for anyone watching to wonder whether the driver was checking house numbers or hunting. The third time around, I caught sight of the driver. Short haircut, oversized sunglasses, and the trademark expression of someone who believed every inch of pavement belonged to her. It was Karen, a long-standing member of the HOA board, self-declared community eyes and ears, and certified trouble. She pretended she wasn't watching. Everyone knew she was. My first guest, a coworker named Daniel, arrived just 10 minutes later. He parked properly, stepped out with a bag of snacks, and gave a quick wave. Before he even reached the porch, Karen's SUV stopped at the curb. She stayed inside the vehicle, but stared at him through the window as if he were a threat to national security. Daniel looked back, confused, but continued toward the house. That was the moment things could have ended. She could have driven away. She could have minded her business. But Karen didn't have that setting inside her. She believed every newcomer was suspicious until proven worthy, and even then, she usually stayed suspicious. The second guest pulled in a few minutes later. Another normal, friendly neighbor I'd known for years. She parked beside Daniel's car. Karen's SUV returned again, this time stopping in my driveway entrance long enough to block the next arriving guest. And then she whipped out her phone. At first, I didn't understand what she was doing. From inside my living room, I could only see her standing near her car, pacing, waving her hands as she spoke urgently into the phone. But I didn't need subtitles to guess the words. I had seen this routine before. The HOA board members loved using non-emergency lines to report anything they personally didn't approve of. Except Karen was dialing 911. My friends outside heard her speak. A couple of them exchanged confused glances. Another quietly took out his phone and began recording. When I stepped outside to see what was happening, she glared at me like I'd ruined her afternoon simply by breathing. Her voice was loud enough for half the block to hear. She claimed my guests were suspicious, that they were parking in patterns that suggested a gathering, whatever that meant. She insisted she feared for the safety of the community. She labeled my guests as outsiders, strangers, threats, all because they parked on my property. The worst part wasn't that she called 911. The worst part was that she believed she had the authority to decide who was allowed at my home. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood by inserting herself into situations no one asked her to be part of. My guests tried staying calm, but tension grew quickly. The driveway filled. The street filled. Neighbors stepped outside to see what was happening. Some shook their heads, already tired of Karen's antics. Others whispered behind their fences, curious but not yet ready to take sides. I walked toward her, hands visible, calm voice, trying to keep things from escalating. But she pointed at me as if I were the offender. She told the dispatcher that my gathering was creating a disturbance. She claimed my guests might be violating community guidelines, though she couldn't quote even one rule. Then, she said something that flipped the situation from irritating to absurd. She claimed all the cars were blocking emergency access routes, except none of them were. They were in my driveway and along the curb, exactly where cars were supposed to be. She simply didn't want them there. When she finished her report, she crossed her arms and waited. Her posture said she was proud of herself. She thought her call would force the police to shut down my gathering, embarrass my guests, and reinforce her authority as the neighborhood watchdog. But it triggered something completely different. A ripple of murmurs spread across the street as more neighbors stepped outside. People were tired of her theatrics, tired of the constant surveillance, tired of the way she used the HOA badge like a personal weapon. And while they didn't fully take my side yet, they were finally seeing how far she was willing to go. As for me, I wasn't afraid of 911 showing up. I welcomed transparency. I welcomed evidence. And I had something Karen didn't know about. My entire driveway, my front porch, and my side yard were covered by high-resolution cameras. Cameras with timestamps. Cameras with clear angles. Cameras that caught her circling the block, blocking my driveway, filming my guests, harassing them, and lying to the dispatcher. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. Unbeknownst to Karen, the police department had received several complaints about her over the last year, false reports, overreactions, and unnecessary emergency calls. She had been warned, but in her mind, she wasn't the problem. Everyone else was. So when officers finally arrived that afternoon, they didn't just look at my guests. They looked straight at her. The morning after the chaotic scene on my driveway, the neighborhood carried a strange tension in the air. People acted like they hadn't seen the flashing lights, but officers raised brow, or Karen pointing at my guests like she was unveiling a crime ring. But the truth was simple. Everyone saw everything, and everyone was talking. I woke up early, made coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. My guests were already inside enjoying breakfast, but part of me knew this wasn't over. Karen never stopped at one incident. She lived for escalation. Her entire identity depended on stirring problems from places where none existed. It was only a matter of time before she tried something else. While I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a text from Officer Daniels. He wanted to confirm a few things from last night. The tone wasn't alarming, but it hinted that he'd stumbled across something unexpected. I wasn't sure what Karen had told him, but I knew she wasn't done making noise. Later that afternoon, as I started grilling lunch for my guests, I noticed a trail of cars slowing down near my driveway. Neighbors pretending to check their brakes, residents trying not to stare too long. The gossip machine was turning fast. And meanwhile, Karen stood across the street, arms folded like a guard waiting for a verdict she believed she deserved. The moment Daniel's patrol car appeared around the corner, she snapped to attention. It was like watching a student wait for a teacher to choose her side. He parked his car and walked toward me, his eyes scanning my property, then hers, then the street signs, then the curbs, all with a measured, thoughtful pace. He asked if he could look around the side of my driveway. I nodded. He wasn't here to question me like a suspect. He was investigating the incident she caused. Karen strutted toward him, full of false confidence, explaining her version of events so loudly it was obvious she wanted everyone on the street to hear. She retold the story like my guests had kicked in my door and taken over the neighborhood. She repeated the phrase, unsafe situations, more times than anyone needed. But then, Daniels asked the question she never expected. He asked Karen why her own car was parked so close to the fire hydrant. Her face drained of color. She blinked hard, trying to come up with a reason, any reason. Meanwhile, the neighbors who'd slowed their cars earlier were now openly watching. A couple even stepped outside to get a better look. Karen stuttered about temporary emergencies and needing line of sight on suspicious activity, but she couldn't talk her way out of a photo. Daniels had taken one the night before, a clear shot of her SUV pressed almost against the hydrant. Then things got quieter, tighter, more uncomfortable. Daniels walked to the other side of the street and inspected the curb where she had insisted my guests were blocking access. The paint lines were perfectly clear, unbroken, and unquestionably legal. It wasn't even a tight fit. It was clean, obvious, and nothing like she claimed. He returned to me, thanked me for cooperating, and then turned fully to her. The way he held his notebook told everyone that something serious was about to shift. It was the subtle movement of an officer who'd made up his mind. Karen's expression changed slowly, from triumphant to confused to panicked. He mentioned receiving several calls from the same number over the last few months, reports that never matched reality, complaints against neighbors who had never violated anything, patterns that were starting to look intentional. Neighbors whispered among themselves now, their curiosity turning into concern and recognition. This wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. In fact, many of them had their own stories, but no one had connected them before. That's when Daniels asked her the second question she didn't expect. Why her car had been on the restricted street corner 3 nights in a row. Her mouth opened and closed again, as if she was trying to push out an explanation that wasn't forming. The wind picked up just enough to make her hair shift, but even that didn't move her from the spot she was frozen in. She knew she was caught in a web she spun herself. Meanwhile, I stood there, quiet, letting the moment do its work. My guests were watching from the window, almost holding their breath, aware that something larger was unfolding, something that would ripple through the entire HOA. Daniels wasn't lecturing her. He wasn't raising his voice. His calm tone was more damaging because it made her unravel faster. Every answer she tried to give led to another contradiction. Every excuse fell apart as he calmly flipped pages in his notebook. She realized she wasn't being heard as a witness. She was being questioned as the source of the problem. As he continued asking questions, something clicked in the crowd around us. Something collective, something long overdue. People began stepping closer, not to defend her, but to confirm the pattern, to share their own stories, to talk about hearing her knock on doors late at night, seeing her photographing trash cans, filing complaints about guests, contractors, delivery drivers, even kids playing soccer. Daniels listened, writing everything down, and with each passing minute, Karen's confidence melted. When he turned back to me, he apologized for the disruption she caused. He assured me the incident would be documented properly, but he also warned me this might not be the last confrontation. People like Karen didn't accept consequences quietly. They latched onto control wherever they could find it. And the HOA loved people like her, until they became a liability. By the time Daniels left, the neighborhood felt different. Tense, awake, aware. Karen retreated to her house, but she didn't slam her door. She closed it slowly, quietly, like she realized for the first time that people were watching her, not with respect or fear, but suspicion. My guests finally stepped out to join me on the porch as the crowd dispersed. We didn't say a word. None of us did. But we all understood something important. This wasn't just about a single 911 call. This was the beginning of something that would expose everything Karen had been hiding. And the HOA wouldn't be able to shield her forever. The next morning rolled in with the kind of quiet that felt suspicious, the sort of uneasy calm that told me something else was coming. I spent the early hours handling small chores around the house, trying to keep the frustration from the night before from lingering. But even with the windows closed, I could still hear the faint echoes of neighbors whispering about what happened. Karen's stunt had made more noise than any of us wanted. I stepped outside to check the driveway, making sure my guests' cars hadn't been ticketed overnight. The city officer from last night had kindly dismissed her false claims, but HOA board members rarely stopped after a single failed attempt. I knew her type. She didn't get embarrassed. She got even. That assumption became reality a little after noon. A police cruiser rolled slowly through the neighborhood, far more cautious than the officer from the night before. This one drove like he already had a file open in his head, scanning each house, checking every parked car, taking mental notes. It wasn't random patrol behavior. It was targeted, directed, called in. I watched from my porch as he parked in front of my house. My stomach sank a little, even though I had done nothing wrong. That sensation, being pulled into trouble that didn't belong to you, was a familiar one when dealing with Karen. The officer stepped out, checked the clipboard tucked under his arm, and approached me with the look of someone already preparing for a headache. His first words came out slow and measured, the tone of a man who had been dragged into nonsense before. He explained that another call had come in, a follow-up request from a concerned resident claiming the suspicious vehicles from last night had returned. He didn't even try to hide the disbelief in his voice. Something clicked in his expression before I even opened my mouth. He recognized the address, recognized the complaint, recognized the caller. When he asked if this was about the same woman from the night before, I nodded. That was all it took. The officer exhaled like someone who had been dealing with her for longer than I had. He told me, without naming names, that he had personally handled calls from her in the past. Complaints about neighbor dogs, complaints about mail trucks for rumbling too loudly, complaints about people breathing suspiciously, complaints that had become a pattern the department now knew by voice alone. The officer didn't need details, he already understood. He glanced over at the parking area, taking in the perfectly legal positions of every car. My driveway, my curb, no hydrants blocked, no sidewalk infringement, no issues whatsoever. His notes were quick and almost annoyed at how unnecessary they were. But he wasn't the only one paying attention. Across the street, Karen was standing behind her curtain, barely hidden, fully invested, her eyes sharp with expectation. She waited for the officer to confront me or ticket a car or tow something away. She wanted a public win, something she could brag about at the next HOA meeting. What she didn't expect was what happened next. The officer closed his notebook, looked straight past me, and stared directly at her window. She froze. He didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't signal for her to come outside. He just held that stare long enough for her to realize exactly what was happening, long enough for her to know the game wasn't going her way. He muttered something under his breath about serial callers, then shifted back into a more professional tone and told me he'd filed the incident as resolved. Again, still no violations, still no reason for emergency involvement. The moment he stepped off my property, Karen's curtain jerked shut, as if she had been burned. But the real twist arrived just as he reached his cruiser. He told me in a lowered voice that if she continued misusing emergency dispatch for HOA drama, the department would start pursuing actions against her for false reporting. Not warnings, actual consequences. It wasn't just idle talk. His tone had changed, the kind of change you only hear from someone who's reached the end of their patience. As he drove away, neighbors began to emerge. A few of them approached me later, cautiously at first, asking if everything was okay. Word spread fast, and every whisper carried the same theme. She's doing it again! She's going too far! Someone has to stop her! Rumors built a quiet wave through the street. Some said she had been warned by the HOA for previous incidents. Others said her behavior was starting to cause internal tension within the board. No one knew the full truth, but everyone sensed something shifting. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't against me. They weren't silent. They weren't indifferent. They were tired. The cracks in Karen's control were showing, and not just to me. By evening, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing. A few people shared security cam clips of Karen prowling outside at odd hours. Others posted screenshots of prior passive-aggressive HOA emails she'd sent under the guise of community safety reminders. It became clear she'd been escalating for months, and this time she'd pushed too hard, too publicly, and involved the police one time too many. That shift, the slow turning of public opinion, set the stage for what came next. And what came next would be bigger than I expected, bigger than she expected, and bigger than the HOA could quietly bury. The officer's warning wasn't just a warning, it was a spark. And the neighborhood? They were ready to watch the fire catch. The afternoon carried a strange calm over the neighborhood, the kind of quiet that usually meant people were paying attention without wanting to be seen. Word had already spread about the officer who had arrived earlier, and how the entire situation had flipped back onto Karen after her own parking was found to be the real violation. Neighbors who once stepped aside when she marched past were now choosing to stay inside, curtains shifting subtly as they watched the fallout unfold from behind the safety of glass. I went back inside after the officer left, hoping that the situation might cool down, at least for a day. But Karen had never been the type to accept being corrected. The more her authority cracked, the louder she usually became, and I could almost feel the pressure building through the walls. My guests were still enjoying themselves, but even they were glancing out the window now and then, sensing that the story wasn't over. By late afternoon, her retaliation finally arrived. It started with a pounding on my fence. It wasn't the hesitant knock of someone uncertain or the friendly tap of a neighbor dropping something off. It was sharp, impatient, and meant to provoke. My guests stepped back as I approached, and when I opened the gate, Karen stood there with a clipboard, a camera, and a scowl so deep it could have cracked stone. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She simply stepped onto my driveway, without permission, and began photographing every corner as if she had been appointed by some imaginary authority. Her movements were abrupt and dramatic, clearly intended to make me uncomfortable, but she didn't realize the more she did, the more evidence she created against herself. She circled my car, snapping photos even though the officer had already cleared it earlier. She photographed the welcome table where my guests had placed snacks. She even took pictures of the air conditioner unit, the mailbox, and the sidewalk edge as if any of it would help her reclaim control. I stayed silent, knowing reacting would only empower her. Instead, I positioned myself where my own security camera could capture the entire scene. If she wanted to perform for an audience, I would let her, just not the one she expected. After a few minutes, she lowered her camera and announced loudly that the board would be reviewing everything. She said it with the confidence of someone who assumed the board was her personal army. But what she didn't know was that her behavior over the past few weeks had already irritated several longtime board members, and they were closer to removing her than she realized. She stormed off after her little performance, leaving the property with the same dramatic energy she always carried. But the real trouble began less than an hour later when a chain of emails appeared in my inbox. Her complaint had been sent to the entire HOA board. Not a single paragraph, not a single accusation. She had sent them a full report, 6 pages long, claiming that my guests were causing disorder, that my car was obstructing walkways, that my lights were inappropriately warm-toned, and that my grass was at a rebellious length compared to community norms. But the best part wasn't the email itself. It was the reply thread. One by one, board members responded, and their tone was nothing close to supportive. Some questioned why she was photographing my private property. Some pointed out that the officer had already dismissed her initial complaint. A few asked why she hadn't addressed her own parking violation first. And one board member, who had clearly reached his limit, asked whether she realized she was creating more liability for the HOA than benefit. The final reply came from the board president. His message was short but powerful. They had scheduled an urgent board review to evaluate conduct and procedural overreach. That meant Karen, for once, would not be the one setting the rules. By early evening, the neighborhood buzz had intensified. People were outside watering lawns or taking out trash they didn't need to take out, anything to position themselves where they could talk without looking like they were talking. My guests stepped onto the porch to take in the evening breeze, and as they did, they noticed how neighbors kept glancing toward Karen's house. Curtains twitched every time she passed a window, and her car, now legally parked, sat awkwardly at an angle, as if she had pulled in too quickly after another burst of frustration. She emerged again around sunset, and this time she carried a stack of printed papers. With her chin lifted as if leading a parade, she went door to door, delivering what appeared to be handwritten complaints about me and my supposed loss of community values. Most neighbors simply accepted the paper and shut the door. A few refused to answer at all. One neighbor returned her complaint by sliding it back under her door minutes after she went inside. Another quietly dropped it into their recycling bin while maintaining eye contact with me the entire time. Karen was losing the neighborhood. But like anyone who relied on control, she wasn't going to let go without a fight. And as the sun dipped lower and the street dimmed, she shifted into her final attempt of the day by calling an emergency HOA meeting at her own house, inviting only the neighbors she thought she could influence. The problem for her was simple. Almost none of them showed up. Only 2 people entered her house. Everyone else stayed home or drifted toward mine, offering support, stories, and updates about her frantic door-to-door campaign. The tide had turned, and Karen, for once, realized she may have pushed too far. Yet, the story was nowhere near finished. Because the next morning, something arrived that would shift every piece on the board and push the situation into a place she could never claw her way back from. Something with my name on it. Something she definitely didn't want me to have. The evening after the incident with my guests should have been quiet. I had planned to sit on the porch, listen to the crickets, and shake off the frustration from watching an officer escort Karen across the street like a misbehaving toddler. But the neighborhood had a way of brewing tension even when the sun dipped low. Something about that day left a sharp edge in the air. Viewers watching around the world, tell me which country you're tuned in from, and if you're enjoying the story, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. As darkness settled, porch lights blinked on along the street, and the sharp hum of sprinklers started their nightly ritual. For a brief moment, everything looked peaceful. But peace in an HOA neighborhood never lasted long, not when someone like Karen felt embarrassed and exposed. She reappeared just as the sky faded into full night. Her posture was stiff, and there was a frantic sort of energy in how she marched down the walkway. I could sense from the moment she stepped out that she had a new mission. Karen couldn't handle being corrected, especially not publicly by law enforcement. Pride ran her entire personality, and she wasn't the type to let even a minor humiliation go unanswered. She carried a folder under her arm, thick with papers she probably printed just minutes before. The confidence in her fast-paced steps told me she thought she had found something powerful, something she believed would force me into compliance, something she thought would make me regret the officer's visit earlier. She didn't walk to my house right away. Instead, she stopped at every neighbor's porch, knocking with urgency. Curtains shifted behind windows, front doors cracked open. Porch conversations that usually faded by dinner time were coming alive again as she moved from house to house, collecting attention like it was ammunition. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. Her gestures were sharp and dramatic. Papers were waved, heads nodded, others frowned. She pointed more than she talked, directing that stiff, accusing finger toward my driveway every time she hit a new house. Some neighbors leaned in with curiosity, others crossed their arms, unimpressed. A few shook their heads from the start, already aware of her tendency to overreact. But one thing became clear. She was rallying people. She was searching for allies. By the time she reached the halfway mark of the street, a small cluster of neighbors had stepped outside. Some were simply curious, some looked ready for conflict. The HOA president himself eventually stepped out of his garage, clipboard in hand, drawn by the commotion. His expression was wary, like he knew her theatrics weren't a great look for the community, but felt obligated to at least listen. Karen pounced on him immediately, shoving the papers into his hands. He skimmed the documents with squinting eyes, clearly struggling to keep up with her rapid-fire explanation. She paced in front of him, pointing at my house with the same accusatory flourish she used earlier. The few words I could make out were predictable. Guest limits, noise policies, parking designation, visitor registration, all twisted, all out of context, all framed to make me look like the villain she insisted I was. Eventually, the president held up a hand. Karen froze mid-sentence. The man spoke calmly, his brows pulled low in thought. Whatever he said made her posture stiffen, her lips pressed tight. She didn't like that he wasn't immediately adopting her narrative. She didn't like that she had to convince him. She dragged her heel into the grass like she was trying to crush an ant that wasn't actually there. She was seething, and the neighbors watching from their porches could see the crack in her composure. Her voice rose again, urgent and irritated. Her hands flew into exaggerated motions. The HOA president looked uncomfortable, but he didn't step away. Instead, he softened his tone, trying to diffuse the situation without fueling the fire. It didn't work. Karen snatched the papers back and stormed down the sidewalk toward my driveway. The crowd's whispers grew behind her. She stomped to the edge of my property and stopped just short of the driveway line, like the concrete was lava and her HOA training forbade her from touching it without filing appropriate paperwork. She planted the paperwork into the ground like a flag. Some messy stack she believed held authority. But the papers bent and flapped in the breeze, refusing to stand upright. She tried again, this time shoving them against the base of my mailbox, only for them to slide back onto the driveway. That's when she noticed the small red light glowing quietly near the base of the mailbox. The delivery camera. The same one that had been recording since the first time she marched toward my yard with complaints about parking lines that didn't exist. She knew I had installed it because of her past accusations, but knowing it was there and remembering it at the right moment proved to be different things completely. And tonight, it was recording every step, every gesture, every attempted rally, every time she approached someone's home to twist the truth in her favor. She turned sharply and walked back toward the HOA president. This time, her steps were slower, less confident. Her shoulders tightened. Whatever she said to him must have been different from her earlier tirade, because he didn't look frustrated anymore. He looked concerned, but not for me, for her. The neighbor's body language began shifting too. Conversations became more hushed. Faces changed from excitement to discomfort. Someone had likely pulled footage from their own doorbell camera. Someone else probably told the group how the officer earlier had reacted. The pattern was beginning to show. The misrepresentations were starting to unravel. By the time the cluster of neighbors dispersed and headed back inside, Karen was left standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching her stack of accusations that no longer held the weight she hoped they would. The night that was supposed to be her turning point had become mine, and she didn't even realize how badly things were about to fall apart for her. The neighborhood had calmed down only on the surface, but underneath it all, the tension felt heavier than ever. Everyone kept waiting to see what Karen would try next. Some neighbors avoided the street entirely when they saw her car, while others peeked through windows like they were watching a live investigation. By then, my guests had settled inside, trying to enjoy the weekend, but the shadows of everything that had happened were still lingering around my front yard. What none of us expected was how quickly things would escalate again. It started late in the afternoon when the summer heat eased into a softer warmth. My driveway was quiet, and most of the neighborhood was preparing for the evening. That's when a patrol car rolled down the road and stopped near Karen's house. Not just any patrol car. This one belonged to the officer who had watched her double park and illegally block the fire lane earlier in the weekend. Everyone recognized him by the way he stepped out with calm confidence, like he'd been waiting for a reason to return. Karen's screen door flew open before he even made it up the walkway. She barreled out with that same mix of indignation and desperation she always carried, waving her hands as if she could shake the world into seeing only her version of things. From across the street, I watched quietly, trying not to draw attention. But even from that distance, I could tell the tone of the conversation wasn't going her way. The officer had come back for a reason. She pointed toward my house again, probably repeating her same lines about unauthorized guests or unsafe gatherings, but the officer didn't budge. His stance didn't shift. He didn't lean in. If anything, he seemed tired tired of being called out for fabricated emergencies, tired of wasting time on non-existent violations, tired of being used as a weapon in a community where people just wanted to live in peace. Then, Karen tried something new. She stormed across the lawn toward the curb, marched to her car, and pulled out a thick folder, pages and pages of the HOA's printed rules, highlighted and underlined so aggressively it looked like she'd attacked the paper with a marker. She held it up like she was presenting evidence at a trial. I saw the officer's shoulders lift as he inhaled slowly. He wasn't impressed. Finally, he stepped away from her and walked toward my property, but not in the way she expected. He wasn't coming to question me or deliver another warning. He walked with intention, with purpose, with the look of someone who had made up his mind long before stepping out of the patrol car. My guests watched from the porch. The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. He surveyed the street first, noting every car, every driveway, and every detail Karen had conveniently ignored. Then he inspected the curb in front of my house, the same curb she claimed I had blocked 2 days earlier. He took pictures, measured distances with a small tool from his belt, and walked back and forth to confirm what he likely already knew. I hadn't blocked anything. My car hadn't even moved since the last time he checked it. The truth had finally caught up to her. Karen followed him halfway up my walkway, still talking, still trying to twist her story into something believable, but the officer lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. It was the first time I'd seen someone shut her down without hesitation. She stood there frozen, as if stunned that someone had dared to interrupt her. Then something even more unexpected happened. The officer asked her about her own parking violations. The fire lane, the double parking, the spot she blocked intentionally during the last altercation. Her face changed from a righteous confidence to raw panic. For once, she seemed unsure. She stepped back, stammering, trying to find a justification. The neighbors watched silently, taking in every second. She had spent years policing everyone else, and now the spotlight was on her. The officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't match her energy. He simply informed her of what needed to happen next, and Karen's expression grew tighter with each word. She wasn't used to consequences. She wasn't used to someone who couldn't be manipulated. She wasn't used to losing. After a few minutes, he walked away from her and came up to my porch. I kept my posture calm, letting him take the lead. He reassured me that the situation had been documented, that the complaints against my guests were baseless, and that the footage from my driveway cam was already being reviewed by the department. My guests listened quietly, grateful, and relieved. That was the first moment since the whole mess started where I felt hope that this could actually end. The officer ended with a final note that further false reports from anyone in the neighborhood would result in penalties. Real ones that no HOA rulebook could shield anyone from. Karen froze on the sidewalk, watching him leave. The moment he drove off, she turned her glare toward my house. A trembling mix of fury and humiliation rippled across her face. For her, this wasn't the end. It was only the opening round. The sun dipped behind the roofs and the quiet evening settled in, but the air still felt charged. The neighbors slowly retreated into their homes, whispering about what just happened. My guests headed back inside, and I stayed on the porch for a while longer, knowing full well that Karen wouldn't let this go. In her mind, the officer hadn't just confronted her. He had challenged her authority. And Karen wasn't the kind of person who walked away from that without a fight.
The next morning began before sunrise, but not because of any alarm I set. The neighborhood was already stirring. People were outside early, hovering near their driveways, watching the HOA office like they expected fireworks. Word had spread fast. The night before, the officer's report had made its way through group chats, porch conversations, and whispered messages between neighbors who were tired of the board's antics. And at the center of it all stood Karen, who hadn't been seen since she stormed back into her home after being the one caught breaking the parking rules she claimed to defend. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, and for the first time in weeks, people didn't avoid eye contact. They waved. They actually smiled. It felt strange after everything, but it also felt earned. My guests had planned to leave early, and they stayed on the porch with me, enjoying the cool air while the sun crept over the roofs. They laughed quietly about the chaos from the night before, grateful that the officer had handled things with fairness instead of taking Karen's word as absolute truth. Even the kids played with a kind of freedom I hadn't seen since they arrived, no longer worried that Karen might appear out of nowhere with a phone ready to dial 911 over imagined violations. But the peaceful moment didn't last long. A loud, angry voice shattered the calm. Karen marched down her driveway like she was leading a parade only she believed existed. Her hair was frazzled, her face tight, and she clutched a stack of printed papers in her hands. She stormed straight toward the HOA office building across the street, muttering complaints at a volume she clearly intended everyone to hear. Within minutes, several HOA board members arrived, looking confused and irritated. They stood outside with her, trying to calm her down, but she wasn't listening to anyone. She waved the papers in the air like a flag demanding surrender. A few neighbors gathered near the sidewalk to watch. They stayed quiet, but the tension was growing. Everyone sensed this wasn't just another morning meltdown. Karen was fighting for control, and the board was scrambling to keep up. Finally, one of the neighbors leaned toward me and whispered that the board had called for an emergency meeting, one that wasn't announced, one that wasn't posted, and one that definitely didn't follow HOA procedure. It wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious. By noon, the rumors were swirling. Karen was demanding that the HOA remove the officer's citation from her record. She also insisted that the neighborhood enforce stricter guest parking rules immediately. She even tried to push a rule that required residents to notify her personally whenever visitors arrived. Naturally, the board didn't want that level of responsibility. They seemed trapped between wanting to appease her and wanting to avoid becoming publicly involved in her ongoing feud with half the neighborhood. The situation reached a breaking point when Karen, desperate for control, marched back out of the HOA office and began posting unofficial rule notices on every stop sign, community bulletin board, and mailbox cluster she could reach. She used packing tape, staples, and even thumbtacks to secure her emergency parking directives, each one written in bold, angry red lettering. Residents followed cautiously behind her, tearing down the notices almost as quickly as she put them up. It became a strange chase through the neighborhood, Karen stomping from post to post, and neighbors quietly removing her proclamations after she left the area. By mid-afternoon, the board stepped outside to confront her. They tried to explain that her rules weren't legal, that they hadn't been voted on, and that the officer's citation was now documented in the official community report. But she refused to accept any of it. Her voice climbed higher and higher until people walking dogs, watering gardens, and checking mail all turned their heads. Then, as if the day hadn't already spiraled far enough, Karen marched to the end of the street and planted herself directly in front of my driveway again. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, clutching her stack of papers like a shield. My guests, still packing their car to leave, paused. The neighbors across the road watched from their porch. Even the board members froze where they stood. For a long moment, the neighborhood felt silent and suspended. And then Karen pointed at me from across the street. She didn't yell. Her voice was quiet, cold, and trembling with frustration. She accused me of starting all of this. She claimed that her life was being ruined because of one guest parking dispute. She insisted she was the victim, and she told everyone that if the HOA didn't enforce her rules, she would take matters into her own hands. That was the moment the neighborhood snapped. One by one, residents stepped closer, not aggressively, not angrily, just firmly. They stood near their mailboxes, their porches, their driveways, fathers, mothers, seniors, young couples.
They weren't threatening her. They were simply present. For the first time, I saw her expression falter. Her confidence wavered, her grip on the papers loosened. And then she backed away. She walked up the street without saying another word. She entered her house, and she closed the door. Hard. The neighborhood stayed quiet for another minute. No one said anything. No one needed to. It was the first time Karen had ever been publicly challenged by the entire community. Not with anger, but with unity. My guests finally pulled out of the driveway, waving goodbye with a kind of relief. The tension settled, leaving a strange peace in its place. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, and the HOA board looked shaken enough to make desperate choices. The next morning, I expected the calm to continue. Instead, I woke to find an official HOA envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a notice accusing me of inciting neighborhood disorder. It was signed by none other than Karen. It was only a matter of time before the next storm began. The next morning began with a tense quiet across the neighborhood. People walked their dogs a little slower, peeked over hedges a little longer, and whispered in small groups on driveways. Word of last night's police visit to Karen had spread faster than anything this community had ever seen. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, expecting at least one neighbor to approach me. Instead, the first person I saw was Officer Langley. He'd stopped his cruiser right in front of her house. Again, the sight alone drew half the street to their windows. He walked up her driveway with a clipboard, measured a few feet of pavement, and took several pictures of her car, still parked illegally across the sidewalk. She stood on her porch with crossed arms, trying to smile like she was the victim of some unfair spotlight. It didn't work. Everyone finally saw through it. By noon, the HOA president called an emergency meeting. It was held at the small park near the entrance, where most townspeople felt safer than meeting in the clubhouse, which Karen was known to dominate. Folding chairs filled quickly. Even longtime members who usually stayed quiet showed up. That alone told me things were about to shift. When the president spoke, he didn't look at her. He looked at all of us. He explained that the police report confirmed the truth. He explained that I hadn't blocked anything. He explained the dispatch logs, the videos, the measurements. Then, he closed his folder and said something none of us expected. He announced a motion to remove Karen from the HOA board entirely. The shock across the crowd lasted only a second. Then, voices rose, loud, firm, and surprisingly united. People who had complained silently for months finally stood up. They talked about her threats, her patrolling, her phone calls, her habit of bending the rules for herself while chasing everybody else over tiny issues. Witness after witness stepped forward. Even neighbors who were usually cautious spoke freely now that the truth had cracked the door open. She tried interrupting. She tried accusing me again. She tried painting herself as the only one protecting the community. But the tide had already turned. The room she once controlled no longer submitted. When the vote finally happened, it wasn't close. She lost her position, her influence, and the unofficial authority she'd wielded like a weapon. And for the first time since moving here, the neighborhood felt calm. After the meeting ended, people came up to me one by one. Some apologized for staying silent. Some thanked me for standing firm. Some even joked that my driveway had become the place where truth finally cracked the HOA. But the moment that surprised me most was seeing Officer Langley again. He wasn't in uniform now, just shorts and a t-shirt, taking an evening walk. He stopped beside me and nodded. He mentioned that the case was closed, that the department had finished everything. He told me that the final report was crystal clear and that the video evidence left no room for confusion. Even he seemed relieved this chapter was finally ending. When he walked off, the neighborhood felt different, softer, quieter, fair. A few days later, the HOA sent out a new map with proper labeling for sidewalks, street edges, driveways, and guest parking zones. The irony, of course, was that my car hadn't been near any of the contested areas. It had been exactly where it always was, inside my own driveway. Karen stayed in the neighborhood, but kept to herself. She no longer stalked sidewalks with a flashlight. She no longer tried to enforce contradictory rules. She no longer acted like a self-appointed sheriff. Life settled into a rhythm. Friendly waves replaced suspicious stares. People's dogs barked less. The air felt less tight. For the first time, I felt like this place was actually worth living in. And every time I walked by the spot where she had once stood, pointing at my car, I couldn't help but think about how quickly things unravel when someone tries to weaponize control. She'd built a reputation on being right. The footage proved otherwise. In the end, it wasn't shouting or fear or confrontation that stopped her. It was the truth, recorded by a delivery cam, undeniable, quiet, and patient. The kind of truth that doesn't need speeches, the kind that just waits to be seen. And now, every time a neighbor brings up that chaotic week, we all end up laughing at the same moment. The look on the officer's face when he saw her own car blocking the sidewalk. The moment everything flipped. The moment the neighborhood finally woke up. With that, the story of the sidewalk incident became the tale everyone told newcomers. A reminder of what happens when someone tries to turn a peaceful place into a stage for petty power plays. And a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one camera and a calm voice to change everything.